politics, romance, and realism. Welcome to Film as History. My name is David. I'm here to guide you through the rich cinematic tradition of the nation of Italy. Italian cinema is characterized by the prominent influence of social and political context, which often manifests in the films themselves. Be it the ritzy escapist comedy of the 1930s, or the vigilante crime thrillers of the 1970s, behind each phase there are observable influencing factors which dictated national interest. The purpose of this video is to give you a brief overview of each major period of Italian cinema, explaining why it occurred, and to give some recommendations along the way. Italy was amongst the first nations for the Lumiere brothers to visit, arriving with their innovative cameras in 1896. Their film cameras were tested by street photographers in the city, so the initial Italian film style was characterized by gritty urban visuals. However, stemming from the nation's rich literary and operatic history, the first narrative films of Italy were often historical epics. This is reflected in the first few feature-length films of Italy, L'Inferno, Quevedos, and Cabiria, all of which adapting literary epics and depicting some kind of disaster or hellish landscape. The latter two are cited by some historians as the first examples of blockbusters, massive financial successes and cultural phenomenons, before The Birth of a Nation would redefine box office success in 1915. Occurring at the same time, though far from the mainstream, would be the Futurist art movement. Futurism is an ideology celebrating modernity, technological progress, and materialism. Unfortunately, the members of the movement were ruthless in their pursuit for future technology, which led to a heavy advocacy for intellectual and financial elitism, hyper-nationalism, and a mindset which encouraged war as an agent for progress. For these core tenets, it's quite apparent why Futurism was highly compatible with the emergence of fascism during the 1920s. And to a certain extent the art movement was instrumental in the rise of fascism, as many prominent futurist contributors would go on to political success under the fascist regime. As a whole, the fringe movement only properly existed for about a decade, during which time it alienated a lot of the Italian art world due to its members' pro-fascist beliefs. This resulted in the movement never really materializing in cinema as it had in other art forms. However, the sole surviving futurist film is often cited as the earliest avant-garde film ever produced. From the 1920s until the mid-1940s, Italian film history is essentially indistinguishable from Italian political history. The National Fascist Party comes into power and the industry begins rapidly declining during the first decade of their regime. The largest factor which contributed to this decline was the government's neglect and censorship of film production. Illustrative of this would be the fact that the first policy change regarding film was a 1923 consolidation to a decree passed in 1913, which allowed the government to censor offending footage. This policy was taken a step further with the 1927 amendment, which stated that all filmic material must be passed through the government, and any footage may be denied clearance for public screening if they do not present sufficient requisites of artistic dignity in the subject's plot or technical execution. This law can be viewed as part of the fascist government's larger campaign to restrict perceived dangerous opinions, such as opposing political views or the remnants of support for Luigi Factor's liberal government. At the same time, the Catholic Church took a stance on moral content in cinema, which is a major problem in a nation so culturally tied to Catholic teaching, and especially a cinema wherein a large portion of public screenings are hosted at churches. Censorship is obviously a huge problem, but a more pertinent issue during this time was the fact that the government established no mechanisms to support the industry during a time of immense economic hardship following the First World War, facing an onslaught of popular Hollywood and European imports. This lack of government support for the industry is compounded with a number of risks taken by film producers during the 1910s, which laid the foundation for an industry in decline. In 1919, all the nation's leading production companies formed to create the Unione Cinematografica Italiana, a film production and distribution conglomerate modelled after the vertical integration model of Hollywood studios. The companies merged in an attempt to hold off the dominance of international imports by producing blockbusters of their own, However, this plan quickly backfired as a result of the failure of numerous high-profile remakes, which led to all the largest production companies simultaneously collapsing in 1926. Through a combination of censorship, box office failure, and neglect, Italian film production dropped from 144 domestic films debuted in 1922 to just 2 in 1931. From that point forward, the industry would revitalise as Mussolini's government added mechanisms to form a propaganda production monopoly. Essentially, the best way to describe the Fascist Party's intention was an effort to imitate the style of Soviet and German propaganda, while once again imitating the vertical integration of Hollywood studio monopolies. Not coincidentally, the individual employed to attempt this business model was Luigi Freddi, who had previously worked in administrative positions at Science until they went bust after joining the UCI. Freddi was put into office by personal friend and son-in-law of Mussolini, Galeazzo Ciano, who was perhaps the single most influential figure in the revitalization of the film industry, despite his short tenure as the Minister of Press and Propaganda. Ciano appointed Freddi as the head of the newly formed position of Director General of Cinema, which in quick succession opened the first film school in Europe, began the first of Europe's big 3 film festivals, restricted the importation of foreign films, and established mechanisms to fund domestic film production. But most importantly, there was the construction of Europe's then largest film production facility, Cinecittà, where the fascist government intended to produce their propaganda. Due to strict censorship and the desire for quick production turnover, the style of telefoni bianchi emerged, taking its name from the white telephones often depicted, which reflected a sense of modernity and wealth. The intention of these films was to instill the Italian public with a sense of normalcy and class during a period of immense economic turmoil, and of course to distract them from the soon encroaching involvement with the Second World War. Italy joined the wrong side of the Second World War. Mussolini fled and was later executed, fascism entirely collapsed, and Italy was left in a state of extreme economic depression. This laid the foundation for the rise of Italy's most influential film movement, Neorealism. What exactly Neorealism means specifically is a divisive topic, and I intend on making a separate video discussing the multifaceted definition of the movement. However, for the purposes of this video, I will cover just the very basics which all historians agree upon. In content, Neorealism is broadly very reactive, both to the preceding decades of fascist control and the current state of economic turmoil. Key narrative motifs include the sympathetic depiction of homelessness, unemployment, and poverty, with stories championing the working class, who are often depicted in opposition to the authoritative ruling class, be them politicians, wealthy elite, unsympathetic employers, or police. Obviously, just based on this description, Neorealism has very overt political overtones. However, I'm having to bite my tongue, as describing Neorealism as political is in itself a divisive statement. However, what's widely accepted is that Neorealism is united under an anti-fascist ideology, evidently in opposition to the prior decades of Mussolini's government. The peak of Neorealism occurred from 1945, beginning with Rome Open City, and began to dissipate from 1948. Again, I don't want to open this can of worms, but 1948 is a significant year, as it saw the Christian Democracy Party win by a suspiciously large margin against the nation's leading socialist parties, indicating a cultural key change away from the ideology that Neorealism advocated for. The nation regained a sense of normalcy after this election, and the economy would dramatically recover during the 1950s. And because Neorealism was intrinsically linked to poverty, the rapid emergence of an overwhelming middle class meant that the lives depicted in Neorealism became outdated. Neorealism is linked to poverty not only in ideology, but also in production quality. The movement is perhaps most famously known for its regular utility of non-professional actors and on-location shooting, producing the movement's gritty sense of realism, which was previously unprecedented. The unique production practices of Neorealism is its greatest lasting legacy, as it will go on to influence all realist cinema, notably Brazilian cinema novo and British kitchen sink realism. Though arguably the greater legacy of Neorealism is in the writing of André Bazin, whose analysis of Neorealism reshaped our understanding of film aesthetic and filmic realism. and would spur the formation of French New Wave, which of course has redefined all of cinema since. Just as neorealism was characterised by the post-war economic turmoil, 1950s and 60s Italian cinema is characterised by the nation's economic revitalisation. This is most evidently true of what I'll term post-neorealist cinema, which saw previous contributors to neorealist film production and journal publication take on writing and directorial roles during the nation's economic recovery. Rather than focus on the working class, this new generation told stories of the emerging middle and upper class. Rather than depict poignant social issues, these films focused on existential dread. Broadly, these films carry many of the aesthetic traits of neorealist cinema, while incorporating more anti-real narrative elements, allowing for the use of famous actors, and lacking the strong social messaging which characterized neorealist films. Of the periods I'll discuss, this is the least concretely defined. Post-neorealism is not a commonly used term, but it has garnered some usage in academia. Peter Bondanella and Manuela Guerrieri refer to this period as the new generation. However, that expression is more commonly used to refer to the generation that emerged during the 1980s. Post-neorealism shouldn't be confused with pink neorealism, which was a dismissive label given to comedy neorealism hybrids, which were perceived as being disingenuous. It's kind of difficult to convey what these films were, though three directors emblematic of this style would be Michelangelo Antonioni, Federico Fellini, and Pier Paolo Pasolini. Following neorealism, the filmmakers of Italy fracture as the nation's economy recovered. Some who were close to the neorealist filmmakers, like Fellini and Antonioni, continued that style of realist filmmaking, but focused on a more affluent subject matter. Others decided to go in the complete opposite direction to neorealism, and began producing comedies. Comedy has always been a prominent component of Italian cinema, which as a whole is characterized by a comically pessimistic outlook on the social context of the time. However, Commedia All'Italiana is the first instance where pure comedy cinema would arise, a consequence of the influence of Hollywood genre cinema, which will be discussed in a moment. From the 1950s until the 1970s, by far the most popular domestically produced film genre in Italy was Commedia All'Italiana. Like post-neorealism, these films focused on the wealthy, explored topics of individualism and combating personal vices, and largely carried a satirical and pessimistic tone. Rather than any one director or writer being emblematic of this period, instead the genre was characterized by a generation of older actors emerging to represent the absurdity of the time. This includes the likes of Vittorio Gassman, Toto, and Marcello Mastroianni, whose coming together in Il Sotto Ignoti was kind of a watershed moment, harbinging this incredible 3-decade-long industry dominance of the genre. Rather infamously, Commedia All'Italiana would stagnate in the 1970s, due to an oversaturation of the market with lowbrow comedies, and the genre would cradle many famous actors during the low point of their career. This coincides with the sexual liberation, and the acceptance of film content which would have previously been deemed obscene, producing the film genre commedia sexy. What has been discussed thus far only really concerns the domestic film production of Italy, but in the 1950s, Italy began receiving interest from overseas. Due to its lower production cost and the appeal of filming exotic foreign countries for the US audience, numerous Hollywood companies began producing films in Europe. The types of films produced in Italy can be divided into two distinctly gendered categories, however both appeal to the same fascination with exoticism and the history of Italy. There were the sword and sandal epics Ben-Hur, another remake of Quevedos, and Cleopatra, and the romantic travel movies such as the iconic Audrey Hepburn vehicle Roman Holiday, and arguably a lot of Rossellini's films starring Ingrid Bergman, Stromboli, Europa 51, and Journey to Italy. Although this period of Hollywood invading Europe is a minor footnote in the history of Hollywood, and tangential to the story of Italian cinema, it can't be overstated just how influential this period was. Essentially, all distinguishable phases of Italian cinema after this point have a direct line of influence from Hollywood genre cinema, which produced this culture of Hollywood knockoffs, which seems like a small oddity to B-movie fans today, but it became a major part of the DNA of Italian cinema after this huge period of influence from Hollywood. One such very famous example would be the spaghetti western. This is actually what encouraged me to make this video, as I've met a few people who didn't know spaghetti westerns were made in Italy. This is understandable, as almost all films use dubbing, and many of the most famous films of the genre starred American actors like Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson. But spaghetti westerns took advantage of the cheap production cost, large facilities, and arid conditions that both Italy and Spain provided. Just in style and quality, spaghetti westerns are an anomaly. It was a genre spurred by the immense talent of individuals like Sergio Leone and Ennio Morricone. Besides the influence from Hollywood, the narratives and cinematography of spaghetti westerns also owe a great deal to the samurai cinema of Japan, particularly that of Akira Kurosawa. However, even this aspect of spaghetti westerns can be credited to the influence of Hollywood, as a few years before Italian westerns rose to prominence, The Magnificent Seven was released, itself an adaptation of a Kurosawa movie. So even in a case wherein you could argue another nation influenced Italian cinema, ultimately it all goes back to Hollywood. Another well-respected, though also undeniable knockoff genre would be Poliziotteschi. Poliziotteschi began to take shape in the late 1960s, owing to the political turmoil of the time. However, the movement really took centre stage with the release of the American vigilante films Dirty Harry and Death Wish. Obviously, it's worth noting that those films starred previous spaghetti western legends Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson, so it's understandable why the public would gravitate towards those releases. Though another more immediate influence would be the real-world civic unrest occurring in Italy at the time. Again, returning to this notion of Italian cinema reflecting the political state of the nation, at the time Italy was going through a period known as the Years of Lead, which saw terrorist attacks performed by groups of both left and right-leaning political extreme. The basic rundown is this: the CIA had been meddling in Italy's elections since 1948, to ensure that the Christian Democracy Party beat the socialist parties. However, by the mid-1960s, the Christian Democracy Party's popularity had waned enough so that a coalition of leftist parties called the Organic Centre-Left were needed to form a complete government. The United States, of course not content with a foreign nation participating in democracy, attempted to orchestrate a neo-fascist coup, which attracted the attention of the Soviet Union. Italian streets became a battleground for the Cold War, as covert operations were undertaken by the KGB, MI6, and the CIA. The films of Poliziotteschi reflected this sense of political disillusionment and civic unrest, as urban warfare and terrorist attacks occurred on a regular basis. This meant a grittier and harsher shooting style, depictions of urban decay, and the glorification of vigilantism. Also reflecting the social anxiety and violence of the time would be the horror genre Giallo. First, it's important to clarify that Giallo has two separate meanings. Within Italy, Giallo describes a style that can be attributed to any film carrying certain distinct traits, whereas outside of Italy, Giallo is used to describe a subgenre of particularly excessive horror films produced within Italy. So, within Italy, a movie such as Psycho would be called Giallo, but in the English-speaking world, Giallo refers to Italian horror films of a particular style. Using Hitchcock as an example was deliberate, as in style Giallo is heavily influenced by the late career thrillers of Hitchcock, in particular Dial M for Murder, Vertigo, and The Birds. What is considered the first film of Giallo even borrows its name from Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, which received a remake in 1956. Therefore, Giallo is characterized by an exaggeration of the traits typically associated with Hitchcock. His fusion of thriller, mystery, and graphic horror elements, with some psychological narrative component. In the most simple of terms, Giallo is like a precursor to the Hollywood slasher genre, as influenced by Hitchcock-style filmmaking and stories, sometimes infused with the eroticism of 1970s European exploitation cinema. The genre is pretty easy to identify due to some idiosyncratic stylistic traits, such as intense saturated color design. the often vague surreal narratives, and the willingness to show graphic violence. Though a very particular style which arguably hasn't aged very well, Giallo has recently come into vogue in Hollywood, with films like those of Nicholas Winding Refn and the remake of Giallo's most famous film, Suspiria. A less refined precursor to Giallo is Mondo, a highly divisive and controversial film style originating in Italy with Mondo Cane. To put it into perspective, I just can't show a lot of footage from this movement. Mondo is characterized by blatant depictions of taboo subject matter, such as sex and violence, portrayed in such a way as to trick the audience into believing they are watching a real documentary. Starting off in the 1960s as something macabre and exploitative to shock the viewer, by the 1980s, Mondo became synonymous with borderline snuff films, such as the Faces of Death series. Mondo is a product of a global emergence of exploitation cinema. Explaining the origin of exploitation cinema could comprise a video in itself, so in short, the style came about through a combination of lax public opinion towards the depiction of taboo subject matter, and the lowering of the financial barrier of entry to begin producing films. That latter point was particularly true during the 1980s, where the public availability of consumer video cameras meant that essentially anyone could produce a movie, allowing extreme and transgressive filmmakers to get their work released, at the very least in video stores. As well as Mondo, some other notable exploitation genres in Italy include the cannibal genre and the zombie genre. Some group Giallo in this culture of taboo cinema. However, I think it's apparent that the films of Giallo are more artistically elevated than a typical exploitation film, in large part due to the talented filmmakers working within that genre. Though that's not to say Mondo left no cultural impact, as its idiosyncratic pseudo-documentary style paved the way for major successes in the US, like the Blair Witch Project and Saw. I've attempted to compartmentalize each genre for clarity, but if you've been following the dates, you may have noticed that all of the recently discussed genres coexisted in the 1970s and 1980s. At one time you could go to an Italian cinema in 1975 and see a graphic art horror, a politically loaded crime thriller, a clean comedy film or a more raunchy comedy film, or maybe even a kitsch exploitation horror film. On face value, a lot of variety, but in actuality your choice of viewing is limited to idiosyncratic genre cinema attempting to imitate Hollywood. This was at a time when even Hollywood was moving away from genre cinema, as the new school of Spielberg, Scorsese and Coppola produced popular and more artistically elevated movies. And keep in mind, national cinema doesn't exist in a vacuum. Hollywood imports still made up a large portion of box office revenue in Italy, and these imports only serve to illustrate how antiquated Italian cinema had become. Hollywood was not the only competition posed to Italian cinema. In 1971, Giuseppe Sacchi established the first free and independent television station, which was immediately dismantled by the government. However, it set in motion a more diverse and competitive television market, which drew audiences away from cinema. Something alluded to before but not stated outright, the rampant Hollywood imitation and exaggerated genre fiction produced fertile ground for the emergence of knockoff cinema. Poliziotteschi copied American vigilante films. The most famous example would be Lucio Fulci's unofficial Dawn of the Dead sequels, which snowballed into Italy's zombie boom. Every unique Hollywood blockbuster at the time had a plethora of Italian knockoffs. If you watch Red Letter Media's Best of the Worst, you will recognize Italian knockoffs as a regular staple of the series.
These simple morality tales just retold by the Italians.
This is something every nation did. Of course, the allure of Hollywood's success is great, and will naturally produce imitation. However, it was so rampant in Italy in part due to the consistent success of the industry, which allowed for the mass production of cheap B-movies, but also because of the established close ties between Italian cinema and Hollywood, dating back to the 1950s. Knockoff films were a symptom of the overall issue of the industry, which was the lack of quality control. As the industry expanded, the most popular genres became increasingly idiosyncratic. To serious filmmakers in the country, the mainstream appeared alienating due to the rapid decline in quality. These filmmakers would either flee to France or Hollywood, or engage in smaller subcultures of avant-garde and experimental filmmaking. As a result, art cinema became increasingly isolated, and equally as alienating to mainstream audiences. This separation of the industry meant that mainstream cinema was not regularly receiving serious and art filmmakers. This lack of new talent made the genre cinema even more idiosyncratic, hence creating this cycle wherein popular cinema was doomed to stagnation. And unfortunately, that's an issue still permeating to this day. The most popular films produced in Italy are limited to comedy films, meant exclusively for a domestic market. Art filmmakers produce films for their niche, while serious filmmakers produce films targeted towards an international market. I'll show you right now a list of the most profitable domestically produced films, and you've likely never heard of them. I study Italian cinema, and I've never watched these movies, because people outside of Italy simply aren't supposed to watch them. These are films that foreigners are not supposed to get. These are relatively low-budget movies that pander to a domestic market, with niche humour and stylistic traits, with absolutely no ambition of international acclaim. Allow me to put this into perspective. Checco Zalone is such an insignificant international figure that his IMDb page doesn't even have a portrait. Scroll down, and his known 4 movies happen to be the 4 most profitable domestically produced films in Italy's history. The same is true of Aldo Baglio and Leonardo Paracone, both of whom have directed and starred in some of the most profitable Italian films ever made. Using just profit as a metric, these are the people who have defined contemporary Italian cinema. Yet, I highly doubt anyone watching this has actually heard of them. And to be clear, an insular domestic market isn't a trend unique of Italian cinema. This has become a trend of most contemporary European cinemas, due to how it's become impossible to compete with foreign imports in the action genre, and the fact that comedies typically don't translate well overseas. This situation produces a conflict for the Italian filmmaker, who has to choose between assimilating with the norm and producing easily successful domestic films which are inherently limited in scope, or risk producing a challenging indie hit which gets shown at Cannes. With all of this said, the Italian film industry will go through phases where particularly outstanding individuals or films will spur inspiration. The first and most famous example of this in the contemporary era would be Nuovo Cinema Paradiso, which pioneered the still prevailing style of tragicomedy. The international success of Cinema Paradiso would inspire the new generation of filmmakers. This would snowball into the second biggest bump to the industry since the 1980s, the career of Roberto Benigni, particularly the immense international acclaim he received with Life is Beautiful. Unfortunately, as time goes on, these rare international successes are proving to be the exception to the rule. As Italy's most talented filmmakers seek greater success overseas, domestic Italian cinema has failed to capture any real identity since the 1970s, or a reason for a foreign audience to pay attention. Obviously, what I'm saying isn't absolute. There are still many ambitious and serious directors who have never attempted to cross over internationally, but there is still this undeniable trend that even a mildly revered director will catch the first plane to Hollywood given the chance. Unfortunately, the unambitious complacency of the domestic market pushes its most talented filmmakers elsewhere. I'm sorry to end on such a dour note. I should stress again that there are still plenty of outstanding Italian movies being produced today. I've attempted to condense the story of Italian cinema into an easily conveyed narrative for a YouTube video, and that story just happens to end with the last 40 years being a bit of a slump. If there's any particularly outstanding or important film you thought I should have mentioned, let me know in the comments. Or if you'd like me to cover any nation in the future, just comment it down below. If you're studying Italian cinema, I wish you the best of luck. I'm guessing you're getting pretty desperate if you're watching this video. Leave a like, subscribe for more, do all of that YouTube stuff. I hope you enjoyed the video. Ciao.